Well, welcome. Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the virtual stage of the Lawrence Family JCC Jacobs Family Campus. Today's event is a presentation of the Lawrence Family JCC and the San Diego Center for Jewish Culture. My name is Ryan Isaac. I am the Director of Cultural Arts at the San Diego CJC. We are in our fifth week of virtual programming here. It's great to see so many familiar faces, and I know we also have some new folks joining us, West Coasters and East Coasters, and in between. Welcome, everyone. And as long as we are all inside, flattening the curve, we will continue to come to you in your living rooms, in your homes, and provide your Jewish culture events. I do want to take a moment to thank our underwriters, the underwriters of the 2019-2020 season. Through their generosity, we are able to continue events just like this one tonight. So thank you very much. Also a reminder, I think a lot of us are figuring out Zoom at this point, but for those of you who have cameras on, it is lovely to see you. Don't forget that we can see you and everyone can see you. So if you want to do something that you'd rather not be seen doing, please don't forget to hide your camera for the moment. Tonight, we are very, very fortunate to have two people with us, Gabby Birkner and Rebecca Soffer. They are the authors of a book, Modern Loss, that was published in 2018. The two of them met and bonded over their shared experiences in loss and grief. I don't want to tell that story for them. I'd rather they, since they are here to talk to us. So welcome, Gabrielle and Rebecca, and please share with us the origin story and how you two met and how this came to be.
Thanks so much for having us. Rebecca, you want to start?
Sure. Yeah, I want to echo Gabby. Thank you so much for having us. I believe that Gabby and I were physically with you, right? Was it last year or a little over a year ago? In La Jolla, right, Gabby, on our Jewish Book Council tour.
Remember we went hiking and
that's right. That's right. It was a wonderful time. It was a little bit different from these times, but we had such a wonderful experience with your community, and we're so glad to be with you tonight. We wish you didn't have to be for this reason, but we're very glad that we can be. So as that kind intro mentioned, my name is Rebecca Soffer. I am, along with Gabby, one of the co-founders of Modern Loss. We started it almost 7 years ago in 2013, at the end of 2013, as an antidote in some ways to, what had existed at the time with regard to community around grief and loss, and especially online community. Both Gabby and I found that there was a real white space that needed to be filled in terms of areas in the conversation that, were not so much geared toward platitudes or, overly religious or overly clinical, like too much, like reading the DSM-5, or just like downright cheesy, because both of us are writers and journalists and producers, and we really bonded with each other personally in the wake of our own losses, through storytelling, through just sharing our stories, sharing our truths in ways that were just, kind of in a let it all hang out kind of way, as opposed to a sanctimonious way where we felt like we had to self-edit all the time. And so we decided to launch a publication that runs personal narratives from people. Now we've run well over 1,000 original personal narratives online about the long arc of loss. It could be 50 years after somebody has died. It's the experiences of the people left behind, of the survivors. And not just that, but of the resilience that is inside all of us. Not just the, surviving through it, but trying to thrive because of, and sometimes not just, in spite of, but because of the fact that you've had a loss. We've since expanded. We have a book that we're very proud of. That's why we visited your community. We do live storytelling events. We're here tonight because the reality is that this is a topic that is at the forefront of everybody's minds. And when Gabby and I launched the site, I will tell you that not only was it not at the forefront of most people's minds in this country, but people thought we were insane and morose because we wanted to talk about stuff like loss and grief. And we just felt like we were being pragmatic, because if you don't talk about this stuff, you can't build community. And if you don't build community, you're all alone in it. And so let's not do that, shall we? Gabby?
Yeah, I mean, I will echo all of Rebecca's sentiments, so that we really saw, what, as she said, a white space in the digital universe. That it was one of those moments that we were having trouble in the aftermath of both losing parents suddenly and tragically as young adults in our 20s and early 30s. That we weren't necessarily finding resources that spoke directly to us, or spoke to us in a way that felt organic. And it was one of those moments, and we were both very pregnant when we launched it, which is in some ways ironic, and in some ways just like the most natural thing. When you think about this life and life cycles and death being a part of life, we decided we wanted to be the change we wanted to see in the world. And we decided to, we know, just being journalists and being in the media and now being authors, the power of storytelling, the power of sharing your story, how you can create community sharing your story, and you can create community bearing witness to other people's stories, good, bad, and otherwise.
That's great, and I think very helpful for everybody to understand where it began. If we can roll it back about 3 months or so pre-pandemic, what kind of atmosphere was that societally to deal with something like this, with loss, with mental health, with the capacity to share grief in general, and how did that set us up for where we are now?
I mean, I think the good news is that over the course of the last several years, especially in the last couple of years, this conversation has been slowly opening up past, outside of these circles that it had been relegated to, like religious communities, therapist office, just like hush hush tones. I think that as younger generations are, digital natives, they feel less like they have an online version of themselves and an in real life version of themselves, and more like, well, what is online is also me. It's an extension of the actual me. It's not like my avatar. And so I think that people are feeling more and more comfortable asking others to bear witness to the fact that they're grieving, reminding people of deep losses that they've had. I think that the prevalence of social media has made it really possible for us to kind of bond as a community situationally. Like, for example, Kobe Bryant, it's something that hits very close to home for everybody here, and including myself. I went to high school with him. How many of us felt like we were mourning his death in some ways? And so I feel like, because it's such a public death. And I think that just in the last few years, there has been this opening. That said, I still feel like up until a few months ago, I still harbored that wish that I could just implant a microchip into somebody's mind. Like, maybe someone I was dealing with professionally, or a friend that I was really trying to get to understand how I was feeling, and just to have them understand for 2 seconds what it feels like, in my case, to go about life without living parents, because my parents died when I was 30 and 34 respectively. And it's very hard to understand what that feels like, and you don't want anybody to understand what that feels like, but you kind of do, because you feel like it would make it easier for them to be truly empathetic. I feel like fast forward a couple of months, and I actually think that almost everybody can understand what this feels like. I think that almost everybody can understand what grief feels like right now, because a lot of us are wondering, what does the future look like? What does tomorrow look like? How am I going to get through the day? How am I going to take care of myself? Like all these questions that when you're newly grieving, you can't answer for yourself. You just have to go micro and try and stay sane. And so I think that that's the difference, is that a lot more people, i.e. probably everybody, can understand grief. And even if it's not grief due to death loss, there's a lot of common denominators in the grieving experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think the innovation that Rebecca spoke to in the sort of end of life and grief, and in regards to end of life and grief over the past, since we launched for sure, and especially over the last couple of years, have yielded in this current state, a lot of innovation of how we reach out to people who are experiencing loss, given that we don't have the tools that we would traditionally rely on when we're hurting. The other thing is, I would echo what she said about really everyone feeling this, because um, I think so much of whether you have lost someone before this, whether you lost someone to this, whether you lost someone during this crisis, but not to COVID, um, and you're just living through it. I think there's a lot of common denominators, as Rebecca said. I mean, I think people feel that like stark before and after that you'd feel when you have lost a loved one. The anxiety, the nostalgia, the exhaustion, and the distraction also, that you feel in the aftermath of grief, you feel replicated. So many people, everyone really on this planet is feels and sees replicated in their lives today.
Is there a loss, especially occurring right now, that isn't equated to death, but is it other senses of loss that mimic those emotions?
Totally. So many. I mean, that's why I was saying I feel like we can all really understand grieving. We are all grieving. One of my friends who was in our book, he wrote for our book, Brian Stelter. He's the host of Reliable Sources on CNN. The other day, I looked over at one of his Instagram posts, and he had a still from his show the other day, and the Chiron said, we are all grieving. And it's true, we're all grieving. We might not all be grieving somebody who died from COVID, although many people are now, and we've heard from a lot of them in modern loss. And some of us, we're hearing about more and more public figures who are dying in this terrible pandemic that's going on. But I think that, like Abby said, just like this grief over nostalgia, over like plans that are not going to happen anymore, or we don't know if they're going to happen. People are, mourning the loss of maybe like a job or career. A lot of people are not only being furloughed, but entire industries are being imploded right now. It's terrible what's happening. There's not one part of life that this is not affecting. And so if it affects your life and it's happening very quickly, too much, too fast, it's traumatizing. And that's what's happening to all of us. Like, we're all being traumatized right now. It's too much, too fast. And our brains are trying to wrap themselves around what's going on because it's happening very quickly. And, unfortunately, I personally don't think that this country and administration did a good job of protecting us preemptively from the extent that we're suffering right now. And so the result is too much, too fast, because I think it took a lot of the public by surprise. And so there's a lot of traumatic grief going on right now.
Yeah.
And it all needs to be honored. It all needs to be examined. It all needs to be validated and legitimized.
Totally. I heard David Kessler, who writes a lot about grief and loss and end of life and worked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And he said, we're all mourning the lives that we all knew before the pandemic. And so whether it's you're mourning the loss from a physical death, or you're just mourning the loss that the life that you once knew, or you knew up until just a month or so ago, it does, you are experiencing that grief. I remember looking out of my window that one of the first days of quarantine, and it's like the world outside my window kind of looked the same. Yeah, maybe a fewer people walking down the street, but it felt so different. And I made the analogy to grief. When you wake up, say the morning after, or in the early stages when your grief is very raw, life kind of looks the same, but your person isn't there. It feels very different. This is a state of as Rebecca said, we didn't really anticipate this, so we didn't have the anticipatory grief, and yet we're all experiencing now anticipatory grief because we don't know what the future will hold, and it feels very scary. So yeah, that's where I am.
Gabby, you had mentioned that during these times we don't have the tools and the resources we're accustomed to in dealing with grief. What do we have, though, innately that each of us might find within ourselves to help us get through this? What kind of...
As I mentioned, I think that culture of innovation right now is really helping people come through for each other. I spoke with a friend who was a rabbi, and he relayed this story of going to the cemetery with just the immediate family, because you can't have large crowds, and who knows if they could even have those 5 or 10 people there now, and how they couldn't pass the shovel because as you do in Jewish tradition, you pass the shovel, we bury our own, and we put the dirt on the grave. And he talked about people using their hands and doing what they can to bury their own in lieu of what they were used to in such a setting. And I think I was thinking about how we're all adapting just in real time. We're not always getting it right, but we're coming up with ways to come through for people. I was thinking about how during Shiva, when you actually go to someone's house, it's traditional for not to say anything to the mourner and let them sort of guide you through this. And I was thinking, okay, well, how can we adapt that? Because you can't be physically present with the mourner and make a Shiva call. There's no deli, there's no anything we're used to in the context of helping people in our communities mourn. And so maybe it's about relaying that tradition to people and saying, I want to be here for you. I also want to take your lead. I want to know what you need, and I want to be here for you. And I think what we have going for us is a culture of innovation, and we're learning to adapt. And I think there are incredible silver linings. People being present at Shiva calls and wakes and funerals that they would have never in normal times have been able to come in for or bear witness to. People connecting in really profound ways despite that distance. And I think actually modern loss is a good example of how really powerful connections can form online. And although we do host live storytelling events and other really powerful in-person events, the thrust of what we have done for the past 7 years has largely been online, and we've been able to create and foster real and powerful connections without being physically present with one another all the time.
So in terms of then the line between communal grief and individual grief,
Mm-hmm.
has that line been blurred a bit now, or is it delineated more strongly than it was?
Yeah, I feel
I think, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, you go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that, of course, like no matter what, you're going to have individual grief. You're going to have people who feel isolated because grief is isolating. You're not going to have one person, even with like the best community in the world and the most understanding partners or immediate family members. You're still going to have that person feeling lonely because grief is a lonely journey. We're all different, so we all grieve in our own ways. Even people within the same family can grieve in completely different ways, and so inherently it's lonely because it's personalized. But at the same time, I feel like right now we have no choice because we're, it's like ironic, we're stuck in our homes. But I think, at least in my experience, and I'm stuck with, I have 2 very little kids. So I feel like I'm flying by the seat of my pants right now. I have very little downtime. But even so, I still feel like I'm more deeply connected to my community and my network than I was like 2 months ago, because in order to maintain my sanity, I need to reach out. I need to stay connected. You can't just like shelter in place ongoing without pulling each other in and asking others to pull you in as well. We need community. I think right now we see how badly we need it. We see how badly we need each other. And I think one of the things that might come out of this experience, which is positive, is more a feeling of like, intimacy among our friends and our family who we've had to reach out to during this time. I think that especially when it comes to grief, people have no choice but to reach out. They're holding Zoom funerals, they're doing memorials, they're sharing stories online, they're doing, public playlists online, because you cannot maintain your sanity at home, mentally and emotionally atrophying yourself, in times of grief. You just can't do that to yourself. You have to reach out. So I do feel like the lines, I guess, are blurring a little bit more, because we are being forced as a survival mechanism to reach out to others. Whereas if we were just leaving our house and going to work and grieving, it would be easier for us to just kind of keep it all in.
Yeah, I mean, that's all right. And I think this is like a loss that the entire planet feels like they can claim as their own. And even as we're all grieving together, all grieving as a community, I think it's really important to remember all these losses are individual losses, and they are personal losses. And we've heard from people who don't want their personal loss and their loved ones' lives and everything they were and who they were and what they did to be obscured by this terrible pandemic and just be like one of many casualties. So I think it's important to step back and really hold our loved ones who have lost someone now, whether to this or to something else, and not let their lives just be obscured by the fact that we're all in this collective shock right now. Yeah.
So with that in mind, what are the tools for self-care, both during this time and even looking forward to once we begin to come out of this general separation, sheltering, distancing? What do you anticipate happening emotionally for people?
I mean, I've spoken with a lot of therapists over the course of the last few weeks, not just for modern loss, but, for family members and friends. And I think one of the dangers, and of course I've read a lot, and a big danger of right now is when you're grieving in isolation, that can, many of us know that grief can be so isolating anyway, just theoretically isolating, existentially isolating. It's compounded when it's actually literally physically isolating. We're not meant to be put in a box in our house and grieve alone. There are reasons that rituals exist, death rituals, grief rituals. These are so incredibly important to our lives, not just the people who are dying to be able to say goodbye, but to our ability to say goodbye and move through the different stages of grief, which don't, they're on no timeline and they're not necessarily in chronological order. But if we're not able to move through them, we're not going to be okay. And I keep reading and keep hearing that one of the fears is that there's going to be a big spike in depression and anxiety. Anxiety is a byproduct of grief that we don't talk about a lot, but it sure is there. There's even a book written about it called Anxiety, the Missing Stage of Grief. And so I think that there are many ways to support yourself while grieving in isolation. I think one of them is an obvious one. Every therapist is online right now, like you can virtually connect with any therapist, even the ones who would have sworn that they would have never done virtual sessions. They are all available now, and there's nothing that really can replace a trained therapist. But I think that there's also other types of self-care therapy that you can do if you're grieving in isolation. I think that there's serious power in writing through your grief, long form, short form, journals, just brain dumps. It's a very powerful process where you can just get down simple memories and feelings. And, even like when you're writing down, keeping, it sounds very insipid. And I know Sheryl Sandberg talks about it a lot, but a gratitude journal, these things aren't like meant to be ridiculous and Pollyanna-ish, but more like grounding yourself. If you can come up with 3 things that you are grateful for on every single day, that is actually a really powerful process because it's building your resilience. And there are studies that show that after 3 months of doing that, you quite are literally, building up that resiliency muscle that you have within you, because it comes more second nature. You actually start to kind of, gear yourself more toward, seeing the glass half full than seeing it, more like half empty. It also is a really good mindful exercise. It just grounds you in the here and now when you're forced to notice things that you're grateful for around you. I think moving your body is really integral, and we're not doing it enough because we're at home. But, endorphins, like you force yourself to just do jumping jacks, take a yoga class, go around the block, force yourself to go outside every day. It's very helpful with that anxiety. That's such a big part of grief. I could go on forever, but I also think that they're, focusing on small comforts. There was a piece that Gabby heralded it. Sorry. Oh my God, I'm so tired. It's 8:30 here on the East Coast. But she published on Modern Loss the other day, and it was really beautiful. And it was about, focusing on the small comforts, how like these awful tragedies actually just make it underscore the fact that you still should notice the small comforts, and they can become great pleasures in life. They take on more meaning. From home, you could even still find a meaningful activity or project in your person's memory while you're grieving. I'm not talking about like, mom died yesterday, let's like do something in her honor tomorrow. But like, there are a lot of us who are grieving recent losses that just happened over the last several months. That's still very recent loss. I know somebody who is a pastry chef in New York City, and she lost her job because she teaches cooking in real life. And her father died by suicide 2 years ago. And so she was just like, I'm unemployed. I know how quickly being alone can lead to depression. I am still grieving. She started making pastries for all the hospital workers at NYU, which is down the street from her apartment. And she started a whole campaign called Bake It Forward. And that is what's motivating her right now. And she's doing it in her father's memory, which is amazing. You don't have to feed hospital workers, but there are ways to find projects in your person's memory. And the last thing, the last 2 things are, I think that there's a huge wealth of content about grief and resilience online that, I encourage people to try and find. We make it easy on Modern Loss because we have endless pieces on the site, but there's also TED Talks, there's podcasts, there's, Instagram feeds. There's a lot to open your mind and give you support and ideas out there. And finally, joining a grief community that offers peer-to-peer support. Again, I don't think there's anything that completely replaces actual therapy, but I believe that peer-to-peer support helped me as much as therapy did. And Modern Loss is a perfect example of it. I think it's really important to have people at your fingertips who can bear witness to your grief, who you can connect over without being forced to dump everything that's going on. We have this huge online closed Facebook group with thousands of members, and anybody on there can just post something saying, I just need to scream into the cosmic void. And other people will say, I hear you and I see you. They don't have to say anything else, or they can ask a question, or they cannot even say anything, but they still feel like they're part of a community because they're reading these streams and these questions and these ventings and these pieces of advice from people. They still feel like they're part of something. And so, that is my very long list of many ways that people can support themselves in isolation. And I will end by saying that it's not fair. You shouldn't have to support yourself. The world should support you. That should, like cradle you against its bosom and tell you it's going to be okay. And, spoon feed you ice cream made from berries. But that's just not the way that grief works in general. And especially during a global pandemic, when everybody is freaking out, it's not the way it works now. And it really does kind of rest on our shoulders to help ourselves as much as we possibly can. It's not easy.
That was great. And
Yeah, beautiful.
Oh, thank you. I think I like went into a zone there.
Yeah. But I think that mindfulness is so important. And I think about the prayer, the Shehecheyanu prayer in Jewish tradition, and I think of it as a mindfulness prayer because it's being thankful for the very moment we're in. We're not thinking about everything that led up to this moment, hard or beautiful or whatever it may be. And we're not thinking about the uncertain future. We're acknowledging and being thankful for the now. That said, as much as we're grateful, I think it's so important to acknowledge that we're grieving. And when in Rebecca and my work, we hear a lot of, well, I lost this person, but at least they had lived a long life. At least I didn't lose this family member. At least I have this or that support. And those at least sentences are almost never helpful when you talk about grief. And people create in their minds this hierarchy of who you lost and when you lost them and how you lost them. And I see that today with COVID. It's like everyone is feeling grief and they don't feel like they have permission to acknowledge what they're feeling because perhaps they don't know anyone who's sick or they don't have a family member, and they feel like, oh, well, relative to the situation in the world, I have it good, so why am I feeling so terrible? So they're not acknowledging those feelings of grief, and I think that's really important, because we can't take care of ourselves until we begin to understand what we need to do so.
that's great. And just thinking about what both of you said, the mindfulness, Gabby, that you mentioned, and Rebecca, you talk about journaling and being grateful and exercising and getting outside. All of those exist in a COVID-free society as well. And I think it probably speaks to where we have evolved to as a society, that we can openly discuss these things and practice these before we get to this point. So there might be some tools in place already for people. And I think the way you laid it out, Rebecca, was fantastic because it's without any kind of pretense. There are no prerequisites to doing any of the things you mentioned.
No, I mean, that's the whole point. And like you say, they're kind of obvious. It's like, oh, we could have done these 6 months ago, but we really weren't, because we didn't have to figure out such desperate survival mechanisms. Grieving is, when you're grieving, you really are trying to survive, but you also have a lot more at your disposal, like, I don't know, leaving your house. And when you can't leave your house, you have to get creative. You have to get creative. And this is when you've got to do it. And I think that something that might come out of this that's good, which is that, like, people who are going through these motions and exercises and grounding themselves, it's going to carry them through the period that, we're carrying through the period when we're allowed to leave our houses, when we're allowed to kind of like rejoin society to a certain extent. And so it'll be this muscle that we're building up that is going to come naturally if we start doing it now.
It's a great way to look at it too. It's conditioning now for the rest of life, not just to survive this period.
Exactly. It's like, so that, God forbid when the next thing happens, and it will happen, not to be like a downer, but as somebody who constantly waits for the other shoe to drop in life, it's funny, every month I'm like, things are so good this month. Like, what's going to happen? I couldn't have thought that it would have been like a global pandemic. And yet here we are. So when the next thing happens, if you're conditioning yourself, you're going to be able to confront it in a way that is a lot more powerful than the way in which you confronted the last round.
It's a wonderful way to look at it. And you before mentioned 8:30 back east with two little kids, and I can relate to having two little kids during this period. And 8:30 is like 2 a.m.
I don't even know if I'm awake. Right, I might have fallen asleep 5 minutes ago.
What can we do for children, whether toddlers, teenagers, young adults? What's it look like? interacting
I mean,
there?
it's hard. I wish that, I have turned to many a child psychologist in the last uh, 6 weeks, just reading wise. Leaning on I have a 3 and a 6-year-old, leaning on my 3-year-old's preschool community so much because it's really my community, and leaning on all of their resources that they're providing for us, like nighttime Zooms with child psychologists, or just like gathering places where we can talk and ask questions. I do know that a lot of us are very worried for our kids. And that's even before, the worry that we have if we're dealing with a loss during a global pandemic, so if we are grieving, please know that there are some amazing organizations out there that are doing wonderful work right now, because they're first and foremost community in mind are grieving kids. One of them is called the Dougie Center. They're out of Portland, Oregon. They have a phenomenal array of resources that are specifically, talking about how to help kids through a global pandemic, how to help grieving kids through a global pandemic. It's like so many different permutations and combinations of ways to help them. There's another great organization called Good Grief. It's out of New Jersey. They also have a huge amount of resources. There are places to go to where you can get a lot of like, what do I do with this age, with that age? Most of our readership are adults, like the staunchly in like mostly 20s to 40s range. However, a lot of those people have kids that they're really worried about. So on Modern Loss, you will find a lot of resources as well for how to talk to kids about death, how to support kids, through a loss, and also especially like reasons why you should focus on grieving kids, why you should not like brush it under the rug and assume that, kids are resilient, but like you have to be very aware of the fact that they're grieving, and that grief in them looks different than it does in grown-ups a lot of the time.
That's great. I want to be mindful of everyone's time, especially yours, Rebecca, back east. If people have questions, you can use the chat function, or we could even unmute you and let you ask. So feel free to think of those and get those ready. And in terms of all the resources that have been mentioned, we'll be sure to provide some links. Modern Loss is easy to find online, but we will let everybody know where you can find both Gabby and Rebecca online, where you can find Modern Loss, and some of the places that have been mentioned. And so following up to that with children, how about dealing with parents for that 20 to 40 demo with parents? I'll be the first to say my parents haven't necessarily behaved the way I would have liked them to during all of this. What do you do looking up that way?
You mean like people who aren't quite taking it as seriously as you would like them to?
Yeah, and conveying I mean, it's not actively grieving, but there might be denial as part of it, or just general failure to emotionally equate what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, I
I
don't
mean,
want to suck up all the air in the room.
no, I mean, I think it's really hard, and it's a really delicate balance, and it's especially hard because people who are lucky enough to have their parents who are in a higher risk group, who are alive and well now, they want them desperately to stay that way, and they can't take care of them in the physical sense that they would in any other kind of emergency, personal, national, global. And so I think there's just a real desperation people feel like. So my father and stepmother were killed, but my mom is alive, and I'm just like, I feel just so desperate, like I want to see you again. And she's well, and thank God, and healthy, and quarantining herself with my stepdad right now. But it's hard because people, they are adults, and they have their own ideas about what this what this means, what this moment means, and how they want to live. But I do feel like among millennials and Gen Xers, there is this real panic of like, I want to take care of you and I want to see you again, and it all feels very uncertain at the moment.
Indeed. A couple questions that we just got up, so I will move on to them. What are the pitfalls of things not to say to those who are grieving, and how can we encourage people who are not willing to share their feelings to begin to explore their own feelings?
Can you repeat the first part of that
Sure.
question, please?
The two separate questions, really. What
Yeah.
are the pitfalls of things not? What are the pitfalls of things that we might say to people who are grieving?
Well, I love taking on that one because I mean, we actually have this in our book. We have an illustration that contains some expletives. So one is, bleep people say, and it says, what to say instead. And I think that like the reality is that there are a lot of things that people say that they're trying to be helpful. People want to be helpful. You're not trying to hurt somebody who's grieving by saying something stupid that doesn't help them. But chances are when you start something that is like Gabby was saying, like at least like comparing, saying like, well, at least it wasn't this, or at least you can have another baby, or at least you're young, or at least your mom met your husband. If you're like kind of minimizing the loss by like adding that at least in, at least whatever is not going to help anybody, because they're very aware that at least statement is a truism. It's not going to make them feel better about the fact that their person has died. You can always, you can always get pregnant again. You can always, get married again eventually. Like, you're such a catch, blah, blah, blah. Again, these don't really help people. They're aware of that they can do these things. Like their minds are working. But they need to be validated in the grief that they're feeling right now. Like, they don't want to think like into the future. They want somebody to sit in the mess with them at this moment. I think that anything that is like, an assurance, like, or I know exactly how you feel, and then comparing it to something that you've been through. I know it's people trying to be helpful. I'm aware. I've had it happen to me. The people who've said things like this to me are not bad people. They just weren't aware that it's just not helping to say, I know exactly how you feel. Like, I had 2 dogs who were like my kids, and they died, and I never got over it, because when your mom dies in a car accident and someone's saying, I know how you feel because I had 2 dogs die, or my cousin died in a car accident. Yes, like it creates a connection. But when you're couching it like, I know how you feel, you're kind of like robbing that person from the ability to share how they actually are feeling. You're kind of like, in not so many words saying, hey, I know how you feel. So like, you don't have to open all up to me about what's going on. And you're taking away that ability to share from them. And then of course, just like the insipid, kind of like the things that are a little bit more religious, like they're in a better place. God needed another angel. I'm a very proud Jew. I belong to a synagogue. My kid goes to Jewish preschool, but it never really quite helps me to be assured of, they're in a better place or whatnot, stuff like that. Because, like, I think the best place that my people could have been were here with me, walking above ground. I also think you never really want to assume that you know how that other person feels religiously about any sort of, spiritual belief, because they may not feel exactly the same way you do. So it's just a way of like not really putting your beliefs onto somebody else. I think that, there are things not to say, but the good news is that once you're schooled in them, it's actually easy. If you really want to help somebody in a way that makes a difference, it's easy to remember this stuff. It's not a long list.
Mm-hmm.
It's just a short list. And
One
if
more
you've
thing
got that,
yeah.
and
One
then
more
you
thing
want
I'd
to take
add
on some of the things that do help.
Yeah. So one more thing that I would say is anything that places blame at the feet of either the person who
Yeah.
died or the caretaker. And you see that a lot, like after there's a horrible accident, you say, oh, at least I never fly in, like after Kobe died, you know, that's why I never fly in helicopters. That's why I live in a house with an alarm, with a gate. That's why I don't live in a place that's prone to earthquakes or fires or tornadoes or anything. People don't want to feel vulnerable, and they want to create order out of this chaotic world that we're all living in. And I think it's happening less with COVID because it knows no boundaries and everyone is affected to some extent. But yet you wouldn't want to say, well, did they go out? Did they travel? Did they, like anything that would say is basically you saying this isn't happening to me and to those I love because they didn't do this dangerous thing that your person did. So I would avoid any of the blame game or asking questions only to make yourself feel better and feel protected.
So what are the right things to say, especially today when we can't be present, we can't give a hug or just sit quietly with someone?
I think like the easiest thing to say, and I think it's like something that's really innate, is just to realize that most of the times we have absolutely no idea what to say, especially as more and more people will be dying because of coronavirus. And we're not going to know what to say to that person that inevitably we will know who loses somebody. It's a very new thing, and it's a very new cultural moment for the whole world. So it's actually okay to say, I have no idea what to say. I've been thinking about it. I've been thinking of like, what is the perfect thing to say? And I don't know. I feel so uncomfortable trying to figure it out, but I love you, or I care about you. And I am so devastated alongside you for this person. You know, my heart is with yours. My heart mourns with yours. I'm with you. I mean, I'm with you in this moment. I'm here for you. I'm here to talk. I'm here to, like send things, and like check in on them and ask them very specific questions. Set yourself a calendar reminder to check in on them. Or if you have a circle of friends, divvy it up and take on a day of the week, and that's your day, and say, what do you need today? It's very easy to actually be meaningfully supportive. That's the best part. It always comes down to just validating the other person's grief and making it clear that whatever they're going through, it's not going to scare you off. You're willing to sit with them in it. They don't have to talk about it. They can just hang with you on a Zoom or on the line or text, and it's not going to scare you off. You're there for them, because that's what people need the most, is somebody to just be with them in this like dark moment.
That's helpful. And
yeah, it's also a lot simpler than trying to come up with the perfect thing to say, isn't it?
I think that's
Yeah, there's no perfect thing. There's no one stock phrase that's going to make everyone who's grieving feel better. So you might as well be honest and acknowledge your own discomfort without putting it front and center, without making the story and the about you, but acknowledging, I don't know what to say, but I'm here. I love you. I care. And I'm going to keep showing up, following through. You can't scare me off from this. So
do you think as a whole we become gentler, kinder, more sensitive community? I don't know if country is a little too wishful for that, but community-wise, if we become gentler, or is this going to be perhaps like a bit of the post 9/11, where for a couple months nobody honked a horn and nobody yelled, and then you kind of flip the calendar and everybody reverts to the animals that we are?
I mean, look, we're probably all going to end up being jerks to each other at some point. And I live in Manhattan, so I'm sure that's going to happen. I don't know that it's a matter of, are we a kinder and gentler community or a society now? To me, I think about a lot, are we a more compassionate society? Are we a more empathic society? Do we understand, like, do we have the ability to really listen to somebody's story, or be aware that you never know what somebody else is going through, in ways that like we just weren't great at that on a broad level several months ago? I think we're going to be better at all that stuff moving forward. Because as I said at the beginning of the call, all I wanted after my mom died was like when I was having drink with a friend or on a super awkward date, and I was on many of those, just to say, oh God, I wish that I could just like inject a little microchip, and then for 1 second he'll understand what it feels like to have a mom who's killed in a car accident. Like, I don't know if to explain anything, or what that feels like of grief. And now we have it. We have that microchip. We all know what it feels like to be nostalgic and to miss so badly the normalcy and the it's kind of a myth of certainty that we had beforehand, but how we thought life was and how we thought life was going to be. We all know what that feels like now, and I just have no choice but to believe that we're gonna be better. At the very least, our mission at Modern Loss is to obliterate the stigma surrounding honest talk on grief and loss, not just in that first year, but like forevermore. It should be something that we can talk about as comfortably as taxes or government. I mean, talking about that is not at all comfortable these days, but it should at least not be less comfortable than that, because that would make it highly uncomfortable. And so I think it will be more comfortable because a lot of us are going to be more open to talking about it. I don't think that we're going to like be so traumatized by coronavirus that we're not going to be able to be empathic and compassionate. I think that we'll still cut each other off on the freeway. But I think we'll be willing to listen to that person's story once we rear end them.
and some of the same reasons that bring people to Modern Loss, whether it's our digital community, on social media, or whether it's to our website, is they want to connect with other people who've been there. And sadly, after this experience we're all having, more people will really know what it's like, and they'll have been there. That microchip, sadly, will be implanted. As Rebecca said early in the conversation, you don't want anyone to go through it, but you also need people who have gone through it, who can really understand where you've been and help you move forward.
That's wonderful. And I think it's a great place for us to wrap things up tonight. Gabby and Rebecca, thank you both very much for joining us. Mindy Chapon, who is our Director of Community Outreach. Thank you, Mindy, for reaching out to Rebecca and Gabby and arranging this. This was wonderful. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. And thank you, Susan, Mindy's mom, for being a part of this too. You've been in my center square for most of the night, so I've been looking at you too. Thank you all, and again, we will get you the information, some of the information that was discussed tonight, out in an email, as well as an archived link to this event, so you can share it and refer to it as often as you wish. Everybody, please stay healthy and get some exercise, get outside, and hope to see you all soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.